Still got people trickling in, but I'll make a start on introducing the webinar. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much to Amy, CEO of Shift, for sort of hosting this webinar with Make Time Count. Just a bit of context on Make Time Count. I'm aware that my name says Jonathan Lay, and that's our CEO's name. My name is Victoria Grennan, and I'm a founder associate at Make Time Count. We create technology to transform the justice sector, and we're always really interested in hearing on new perspectives and approaches to the justice sector. So that has brought us to our webinar today with Amy from Shift. Shift exists to break the destructive cycle that children and young people are caught up in or at risk of crime. They seek to transform the policy and practice in how young people in these circumstances are seen and supported. So we're really excited to hear directly from Amy on Shift, Shift's approach. Amy has 16 years of experience of teaching, studying and researching within the criminal justice and legal space. So yeah, I'm sure everything that Amy chats through today will be brilliant to hear. Cool. So Amy, if you're ready, it'd be great to hear about a bit more about Shift, an explanation of your policy and practice approach, and sort of how you've come to what you're doing today.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. It's lovely to be invited to speak, and excellent to see so many people who've joined us. So Shift, as sort of Victoria started to introduce, we're a systems change organisation, and we take a very practice-led approach to systems change. So we got going around 5 years ago, founded by a group of fantastic people, all of them in their own right, sort of systems thinkers, systems leaders, including people like Josh McAllister, who chaired the independent review of children's social care. And those founders had a bold vision and ambition for children caught in cycles of crime. They noticed that despite the best efforts of lots of professionals, there is a group of children with high levels of unmet need who've experienced significant cumulative disadvantage, and the outcomes for those children are generally quite poor. Those children are disproportionately Black, Brown, mixed heritage, and so they were interested to say, what could we do differently, getting alongside and being part of public services and partnering with public services to really sort of seize that invitation to transform outcomes for those children and young people, and use what we learn from trying to intervene differently and get alongside them differently, to stimulate a conversation about systems change at that local level, but then also thinking at the kind of meso regional level, and then up into the national sort of policy and practice arena. And I guess at the heart of Shift is this idea that the children and young people that we're talking about, who are at highest risk of being caught in cycles of crime or who are already caught in cycles of crime, at the minute, business as usual for them within the youth justice space, children's social care space, but also thinking from an education policing space. It often is kind of short-term interventions that lots of people come into and out of their lives. And our idea is what might make most difference to them is having a consistent, trusted relationship with a highly skilled professional for at least 18 months, and that professional walking with them through all aspects of their life, doing lots of work, not just with that child or young person, but with the professional network, with their peers, with their family. So really thinking about how can we change the context around this young person? How can we make systems and processes interact with them differently? And some of that comes quite a lot from thinking about how do we change the story about that young person who and often there's quite a deficit focus, but really thinking about what are their strengths, what are their hopes, what are their aspirations, how do we build on those and use those to address some of our concerns and sort of risks around these young people. So we've been putting all of those ideas into action over the last 5 years, and we've partnered to date with 7 brilliant local authorities who have created Shift practices, so teams of multidisciplinary teams of highly skilled professionals who work to the Shift practice model. They work as part of local authorities, so we call this an insider-outsider approach to sort of systems change and to practice, and we from a national team support and challenge them to make the work the best that it can be, and also to build that evidence base that we can use to influence broader change.
Yeah, brilliant, Amy. That's really interesting. Thank you. And recently, have you seen kind of with maybe of a more national perspective with the Labour manifesto commitment to young futures, and obviously you work with local councils, have you seen that there's been more of like an uptake recently in that shift systems and approach? Like, how do you see this sort of moving in the future with what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, need is depressingly high.
Mhm.
You know, unfortunately, thinking about the impact of COVID, particularly on young people's mental health, though we have made real strides in the system. So I think they're about the role of the Youth Justice Board and Child First. That has led to lots of children and young people being diverted from custody, which is a real success given all that we know about the trauma that's caused in custody and actually how high reoffending rates are for most people coming out of custody. I'm really pleased to see that we're diverting children from that and trying and being more creative in how we meet their needs in the community. So that feels like a positive, and yet we know that those children who are highly vulnerable, who are in really difficult contexts, that haven't gone away. So those same children we're now meeting more often in the context of children's social care. So they might be children who are on, you know, deprivation of liberty orders and other things. So the problems are still there, but they sort of shifted within the system. And the other context that's sort of relevant there would be one of finances. So, you know, councils are under massive financial pressure. So it's a complex constellation of things for Shift, that the need is there. There's a real interest in doing differently, working differently with this group of people for some really good reasons. But I think there are lots of competing tensions that we're trying to navigate, one of which is money and underinvestment over quite some time. And it's in that reality that the Labour government has stepped in, and there aren't, you know, buckets of money to throw at this. So I think from that perspective, Shift is quite interesting because of this insider outsider approach to change, that we are not about additionality. We're about getting in and alongside public services and asking how could those public services transform themselves to drive better outcomes, which also has benefits to the public purse. So I think in a helpful way for Shift, we're quite well placed to be a thinking partner and a practice partner for national government. Local government is very interested in our work. There are just some absolutely paralysing financial kind of realities to some of that. And in terms of going back to Shift's mission, our aspiration at Shift isn't that we're in every local authority. Our aspiration is that we are testing the model, evidencing the model, learning in different locations to build that evidence base. So we're straddling, as an organisation, we're kind of straddling the tension between real need, really urgent need, and our ambitions for systems change, and thinking quite carefully about where do we place our efforts if we're, you know, real about the systems change ambitions.
Yeah, and that's really interesting in terms of I guess like Labour's manifesto commitment to young futures. So in terms of that pledge, like what do you sort of know about that commitment so far? How has that affected your work, and how you hope to work in the future with government and local councils?
Yeah, so Young Futures is a sort of Home Office led, so it's one of the Labour government's manifesto commitments and missions. It's a Home Office led mission, and in its first iteration, it's focusing particularly on children who are caught up in knife crime. So it's a mission that promises to reduce violence and harm that's caused through possessing, using knives. It's also got aspirations around improving mental health outcomes for young people. So the hypothesis there being that some of the children caught up in knife crime have unmet mental health needs. So some really important focus of government on something that, you know, clearly is devastating to everyone who is harmed by knife crime. I think one of the things to hold in the balance there is that while knife crime is devastating, we've also got to be evidence-led in sort of understanding its prevalence and keeping a sense of proportion about that. We know, for example, that many more people possess knives than actually use knives, and so getting under the skin of, you know, what's the political concern that's animating this. How well does it align with the evidence? And if we really think about the problem of possessing a knife, often that's linked to feelings of unsafety on the part of that young person, feeling unsafe in their community. How does that help us to think in different ways around the policy and that policy ambition? So I think we are, as well as others, doing a bit of influencing work or in sort of discussion, seeking to really understand the government's intention in this policy area and what it exactly understands the problem to be, so that we can be sure that we're designing the right kind of response. We don't yet know how much money is linked to this ambition, so that's something that's going to be linked to the budget. So we're expecting that next month, though there have been some kind of indications. We would like very much at SHiFT, we'd like to see this building on some of the great work that's already happening to date, that we can evidence as making an impact in relation to the safety of young people and reducing conflict with the law. So, and in that respect, I think a lot about the work that happens through the Greater Manchester Violence Reduction Unit and the Greater London Violence Reduction Unit. So we've seen those particular VRUs commission some really excellent work and be able to evidence its impact. So, this is not, and in my version of the future, this is not, this should be building on local strengths, carrying that work with it, and it being sort of very carefully tailored for the local communities. And importantly, taking statutory services with it. So I think one of my concerns about this is that it hasn't so far necessarily attended enough to the sort of the statutory component, that if we really want to make an impact with these children, these are all going to be children who are known to services in one form or another. And to really make an impact there, we need to be understanding how we can help those services get alongside those young people differently, in partnership with the VCS, the voluntary and community sector. But yeah, we would like to see that sort of tied up, and that's the level of detail that we and others are in conversation to try and shape that, as well as, I think the other big unknown for me is the commissioning relationship. So at what level is this relationship going to be held? Where's the money going to flow into? Is it going to be local authorities? Is it going to be violence reduction units? How does that map across geographically? So there's lots of really important design questions, which can sound a bit boring, but actually are really, really important for getting this right. And if we can get it right, I think there's a real opportunity here to address some really important systemic issues, which yes, please.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant to hear, and hopefully a hopeful future. And so sort of a question mainly from me actually is, you mentioned the violence reduction units doing a very good job, for instance, in Greater London. I kind of wondered, like, how do you see, or how are you hoping to sort of see, like, the regional sort of policy change? And do you think that this will be an uptake that will gradually happen, or do you think that this will be something that is going to happen across all regions equally? And what's sort of the nuance needed for each region and locality here?
Yeah, so we know that there are some important differences in patterns of crime and vulnerability for young people. There are important differences that might need to be attended to about rural versus urban, for example. Not every area has a well-funded violence reduction unit. So the two that I've mentioned in London and Greater Manchester, have very significant operating budgets compared to, for example, Cleveland's violence reduction unit. So we also do some work there. And so that's one of the realities that we are inviting or encouraging government to think about. How could we use the significant expertise of VRUs in those bigger areas, which are much more well-resourced, to really support, levelling up is the language of the old government, but that sort of agenda of supporting areas where there has been much less investment. And I think in that respect, I think particularly of our work in South Tees, so in Middlesbrough and Redcar and Cleveland, where there are very significant concerns around exploitation and criminality intergenerationally impacting young people and their families, and an entrenched, I would say, kind of poverty of aspiration from an education perspective, young people being excluded, so some really sort of serious systemic issues. And this is an area that, in a way, has really been left behind, I would say, in terms of investment and focus. And this policy, Young Futures for Me, could be an opportunity to really target some resource very thoughtfully in a multi-agency way to make an impact to those sorts of kind of wicked problems that have existed intergenerationally. And that's where I think SHiFT's focus on breaking cycles is so interesting and helpful, because it's cycles that exist within people and within their families, but it's also cycles that exist within systems in how we respond to people in need who are causing harm to others or to themselves. And that's, that's at the heart, grappling with that is at the heart of systemic change, but it's hard to do, and it requires I think the convening power of either national government or kind of usefully at that regional level to start having those kind of the right scale. So unitary authorities are very interesting from that perspective. So somewhere like Essex, for example, is the size of 5 London boroughs, and when you have an operational footprint of that scale, that gives you really exciting opportunity to dig into those systems and to start having that systemic impact. So yeah, we've been playing on all sorts of those ideas, and obviously that intersects with the sort of political choices that are made around devolution. And Greater Manchester, from that perspective, is a very exciting place to be. Andy Burnham's leadership there and the sort of the track record of him making some really positive local impacts for the people of Greater Manchester is helpful to us at SHiFT.
Yeah, I think that perspective is really interesting, and sort of like maybe a different direction, but you touched on sort of diversionary practices and potentially, so for instance, maybe out of court resolutions for young people in the justice system. I sort of wondered if you had a bit more sort of information on sort of the realities of those diversionary practices, and from your perspective, having put in the SHiFT operational model, like where do the challenges come, but where do the opportunities come in diverting young people from court or from the system?
Yeah. So I think probably what I said earlier, I hope emphasised that there's no naivety in SHiFT as to risk and vulnerability. There's a really important public protection reality to all of this, that some young people are causing themselves and other people really serious harm, and we need to feel confident that we are intervening to keep them and other people safe. And so I guess while I absolutely welcome fewer young people coming into custody, it does mean that we have to be really confident that our youth justice system, so in terms of community disposals, is robust, that it's well resourced, it's well configured to hold high levels of risk, and where those young people aren't on orders, because that is an increasing pattern. So it's not uncommon now for some of the children we work with to be no further action by the police. So if you look at their records, you wouldn't necessarily, everyone in their power is doing their best to be child-centred and to avoid that stigmatising impact and contact with criminal justice. But the risks are still there. And one of our kind of concerns about the current configuration of the system is that if they're not receiving focus from youth justice for really good reasons, either in custody or the community, what are they being diverted to in relation to children's social care? Because that's really the only other sort of system, statutory service that can meaningfully pick up and support the most vulnerable children. But one of the sort of historical and contextual realities of that system is that it has more designed and operated thinking about younger children or harm within the family home than it has in terms of risk and safety outside of the home. And this is particularly important when we're thinking about the young people we work with, who we work up to the age of 25, but they are predominantly adolescents. And, a lot of the risk and concern exists outside of the home. Now sometimes that's also inside the home, and that's often the case. There's a complex interaction between the young person's safety at home and in the community. But what we're calling attention to, and it's not just us, it's lots of others, is sort of how well equipped is children's social care to meet the challenges of adolescent risk, to use a kind of catch-all, where that risk might be much more apparent or require some different thoughtful action in the community. At the moment we have young people who are being held on child protection plans, and the category that enables them to be held in that way is neglect. That is a very poor and sometimes unhelpful description of what the actual need is there. So we are pushing, there is some really innovative and helpful work that's going on, being led by the DfE and by children's social care colleagues, to think about how does the system rise to that challenge. But yeah, there is something where there are real risks that some young people are falling through the cracks of those systems, particularly I think adolescents. And if you go back to the independent review of children's social care, we know that teenagers are the fastest rising group of people coming into care, and they've been highlighted as a group of young people who are most being let down actually by business as usual at the moment. So yeah, we are thinking through, part of a practice community, thinking through how do we meet those needs, and respond to the really welcome shift in the system that's diverting children and young people from custody. I think the other piece for me that is important here, often courts and judges aren't brought into conversation about systems change, and I think there are some really interesting reflections about how their practices are changing, and how changes in professional responses to harm alter the sorts of cases that come before them, might invite them into new spaces for using their discretion and decision making, disproportionality. So one of the things to be clear about is that while it absolutely is true and welcome that the prison population for young people has come down, it hasn't come down equally for all young people. So we and it's least favourable for Black, Brown and mixed heritage children. So we are continuing to disproportionately imprison Black, Brown and mixed heritage children, and in the face of all that we know about the very damaging outcomes, and that's also true in the care system, that if you're a Black, Brown or mixed heritage young person, you are more likely to be taken into care, and outcomes for children in care are very poor. So that's another kind of important aspect of our context, and that's partly why SHiFT's practice approach, we have a systemic practice approach which centres anti-racist and anti-oppressive practice, and that's really, I think that's got to be at the heart of any effective practice when we're working with this group of young people.
Yeah, and I think that's so important that that's sort of like at the forefront of what you're doing, because obviously it's such a disproportionate way to approach youth justice as well. And I think one of again, like maybe another question that's following on from this is, so it's spoken about practices for diversion and the realities of that, sort of from your perspective, what sort of practice or policy change needs to sort of happen for prevention here, and what could the system be doing to actually help children, and so that they're not caught in these cycles of crime? I know that's a very broad question, but if there's any sort of like ideas for change that that you've got in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, so the ideas of change at the heart of SHiFT is very much that consistent, intensive relationship. So I think we have to start by recognising that while business as usual might work for, and work is a loose term, right? We can talk about what work means, but say 90% of children, 95% of children and young people maybe, there is a group of children who have the highest levels of unmet need and who have experienced the most significant cumulative disadvantage, and those systems are not going to work for those children and young people. And we need to, I think, and SHiFT's invitation is to say, let's not start with business as usual. Let's start with what this child and young person needs. and let's use all the evidence that we know from practice and also from research about the power of relationship-based practice. So we centre the relationship as the agent of change with this young person. It's in fact the only thing we really have. So, you know, while there is some evidence around the effectiveness of particular interventions, at the heart of all of it is actually a relationship, which is a high support, high challenge relationship. It's a combination of love and boundaries. You know, I think about parenting, and offering that young person that relationship to walk with them across all aspects of their life, so that the system folds itself around them rather than we're expecting young people who are vulnerable, marginalised, to have to navigate what is, even as a professional, a highly complex system. Sometimes the children that we work with, and again, I'm using children politically to include young people up to the age of 25. They come to us and they might have 10 professionals, 15 professionals already involved in their lives, and they're getting a substance misuse worker, they're getting a drugs, you know, they're getting a mental health worker, they're getting a family worker, they've got a youth justice worker, a social worker, and the social worker might change every few months because of churn in the system. Like, that is so overwhelming. It's so confusing, even to a professional. And also importantly, I think what it does is sometimes create drift and inertia in the system and not drive accountability for outcomes and progress. And I think it can also, because these well-meaning group of professionals, but they're coming often at fairly sort of short-term periods into this young person's life, they don't have the opportunity because of high caseloads or other things to build that relationship. We're getting snapshots of those young people reflected on recording systems that aren't even accurate sometimes, but importantly omit the sort of strengths, hopes, aspirations, protective factors in the analysis, and you get kind of professional analysis that becomes almost like self-perpetuating. And so we're actually missing opportunities where we could be intervening through the relationship, and by thinking about the peer network, professional network, family network, really creatively, where we could be reducing risk. And so, yeah, so I think that has to be at the heart of saying we're not okay with mediocre for this group of children and young people. There is a public protection imperative to do better, but there's also just an ethical imperative around children and young people that every child and young person in this country should have the opportunity to live a safe life, and a life in which they can flourish and contribute and certainly not cause harm to other people. So it's on us as the adults in the room to think, yeah, we can work differently and meet all of our statutory responsibilities. So it's not about in any way dialing down the level of support for these young people. It's about honing it, it's about tailoring it, making it actually effective. And when we do that, I think we also can realise savings for the public purse, because the reality is it's hugely expensive to be working ineffectively with these young people. It's ineffective. We're spending a lot of money now that isn't leading to the outcomes that we want. And if we don't get the outcomes we want, we know that things are likely to escalate. That's the point at which Shift steps in, where things are getting worse rather than better. And, you know, costs of secure accommodation, costs of placements in this country linked to the absolute breakdown in the market around placements. Some of the children we're working with are in placements of £15,000 to £20,000 a week. And that might be good and appropriate where they were delivering excellent outcomes through those placements, and some placements are doing some good work. But you know, as we've seen in lots of government reviews now, there's lots of policy concern. Too often those placements are not delivering great outcomes for those young people. So we've got to break out of this. Again, it's that cycle of how the system's responding, and be brave and invest to save, invest to do the right thing with these young people, and that will reap benefits intergenerationally, because we know that if we can get this right for this generation of young people, they will go on to be hopefully better parents, and the scripts and the opportunities that their children will inherit will hopefully be different, so that they don't become caught in a cycle of crime as well.
Yeah, I think that perspective of sort of breaking that cycle, not only for young people and children now, but also for the adults that they're going to be in the future, is really, really important. And I guess you've already mentioned a few points, but if you could sort of summarize like Shift's sort of manifesto for change. So if we sort of end on that note, before we get to the Q&A, like what are your proposed changes and sort of vision for reform in the sector? If you could sort of, yeah, like break those down into a summary, that would be brilliant.
If I had a wish list, it would probably start with the age of criminal responsibility, which feels a bit trite because it feels politically very unrealistic. But I think actually there are lots of problems that stem back from that. My other wish list would be that we close the youth custody services. So I think youth offending institutions, as they're currently framed, are really not achieving what we want them to achieve. And what we need in their place are smaller therapeutic residential offers for young people where secure accommodation is most needed. I think my other wish list would be that we is a system redesign. So I think in each area, the children and young people keeping us awake at night with those highest levels of need, let's just be child-centred. Let's turn the systems on their head and let's just work with those children and tailor everything around those children and see what happens.
No, that's brilliant. Thank you so much, Amy. And sort of just, is there anything else that you'd sort of like to touch on before we sort of launch into a Q&A with the audience? Is there anything that you felt like you want to communicate or
No, let's go.
through?
Let's see where
Yeah.
questions take us.
Perfect. Okay. So everyone, there's a Q&A functionality. There should be at the top of your screen. So if you have any questions, please feel free to type those in to the discussion, and we'll ask Amy any key questions that you've got. So we'll just wait for those to trickle in. Okay, while we wait for those to trickle in, Amy, I'd just actually like to ask a quick question. Oh, here we go. I'll get to my question after. So we have a question from Heather Coombe. Heather said, Amy, it is incredibly heartening to hear about Shift's approach, taking these practical steps to implement what we know is needed and combating long-standing siloed approaches around young people. The consistent, intensive relationship is absolutely what everyone knows is necessary, but just doesn't happen. In relation to custodial disproportionality, are you able to share any insights as to why that's happening or the causes? Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Heather. It's complex. So and it's multi-systemic. So there is lots of evidence that starts in early life, so in early years, and we can trace back there underinvestment in services. We can trace back vulnerability in the domestic home. We can think about exclusion, and if we look at exclusion data, we know that there is disproportionality. I think it's starkest in relation to Black Caribbean boys, Asian Pakistani and Asian Bangladeshi boys, to be sort of particular. So we know that that boys from those groups with those ethnicities are likely to be disproportionately excluded. We know that exclusion leads to poorer life outcomes, often in terms of qualification and attainment. It can create vulnerability in the community through displacement and not having a sense of belonging. So there are, like, while roots in are different for everyone, there is a constellation of evidence that shows that at lots of the critical points in the system, you are more likely to get a poor outcome if you are Black, brown or mixed heritage. If I think about stop and search data, for example, and policing practices, We know that you are more likely to be stopped and searched if you're Black, brown, mixed heritage. You know, there are just at every level of the system. And I think one of the problems is that it's easy to explain away and contextualize at every stage of the system. But cumulatively, these things come together and are causing enormous harm to our Black, brown and mixed heritage children. If I zoom forward and think about, you know, court experiences and the decimation of legal aid, and that as one of the contexts that feeds into children in court sometimes not having the advocacy that they need, not having the people that they need on their side to make the case for the alternative. One of the striking things that, again, while we're sending fewer children to custody, of say 400 children who are in prison, half of those children are there on remand rather than being sentenced. And of those children, say about 200 children who are remanded rather than sentenced, we know that about 65% of those children will walk away without a custodial disposal. So that begs all sorts of interesting questions about why is it that those particular children are showing up in court and judges are feeling so worried about the ability to contain their risk and vulnerability in the community that they're being remanded. And a few days later sometimes, so if you look at the HMIP did a thematic review around this, in some instances children are in custody for a few days and then Youth Justice and other colleagues are putting together bail packages and they're being released. So there's all sorts of really complex factors that cumulatively add up to arguably among our most vulnerable children and young people being in custody, and they are disproportionately Black, brown and mixed heritage. And structural racism just as a reality that is ingrained across and within so much of the practice and the systems that shape their lived experience. So that's a long answer, and but it's to emphasize its complexity. And I'm not at all insinuating that, you know, at every stage I really do believe that there are well-meaning professionals trying to do their best, and that's more the case than it isn't the case, but at too many points in the system, race and questions of ethnicity and identity is not being centred as part of the conversation, and I think we're not having brave enough conversations about these things at all aspects, across all aspects of our practice. And I think it was the Lammy review that had this sort of line of if there's an anomaly that needs to be explained, or you need to sort of reform. And I think that's quite a helpful mentality to say there is a difference in outcome here. How can that be explained? How can that be changed?
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Amy. And we have a few more questions. So we have one in the chat from Oluyombo. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And they asked, any toolkits to engage with offending youth? And if so, can you send over to my email? So obviously, Amy, if you do have that and you're happy to share, I'll manage that for you. But yeah, do you have sort of any toolkits for that engagement? So
we resist toolkits. I should probably, that's my opening response to that. So and that's not to say there aren't lots of really helpful tools that highly skilled practitioners can have in their toolbox that can make a real difference. But I guess at the heart of everything that SHiFT is that relationship. And so our focus of our training and our approach with our practitioners is really systemic ideas. So how do you hold curiosity, for example? How do you resist simple binaries and take a both and position? How do you think about opportunities for influence that sit outside of the young person and sit in the space that's kind of in between people? So we've got a real focus on thinking about the relationships that exist. What are the scripts? What are the dynamics that exist and have existed in those relationships, and how can we interrupt and kind of punctuate them in our practice and our actions? How do we change, like, what's the dominant story around this young person, this family, this incident, and what are some of the untold stories, the unheard stories, and how can our practice seek to surface those to again change that kind of narrative? So we have, you know, we have a framework, we have something called Shift Ways that helps our practitioners operationalize Shift's ideas across all aspects of the practice, and within that we've got you know, handbooks. But I actually think you know, my encouragement would be less to just take a tool and more to come and join us on some systemic training, come and join us in sort of thinking about those ideas, and by exposing yourself to those big ideas, be part of the kind of community that's putting relationships at the heart of practice.
Yeah, and brilliant. It sort of leads on to another question that we have. So John said, Amy, great overview, thank you. How would a child-centred approach be delivered? What would it look like operationally, and is this being trialled anywhere?
Yeah, so we are doing this. We've been doing it with 7 different local authorities, and what it practically looks like is going into a local area and speaking to all of the different practitioners. And we start with the question, who are the children and young people who keep you awake at night, and why? And we triangulate that with data, and from that we identify the sort of 30 or so children in the local area where there's escalating concern, high levels of unmet need, they typically are across children's social care and youth justice, so on child protection plans, edge of care, and we invite those children to work with Shift, and we work with them intensively for 18 months, at least 18 months. We work with everyone involved in their life. We use child and family practice discussions to structure, so those are weekly practice meetings using systemic ideas that help us to sort of deliver our practice model, and we've got some strong and ever growing kind of evidence around impacts for children through working in that way. So a growing number of our children are completing our programmes, and we've got ongoing evaluation, including monthly data sharing. So we are pretty obsessed with outcomes and progress for children, and that is reviewed against 4 outcomes, so and lots that you would expect. So loved and cared for, safe and stable, sense of power and purpose, and sitting underneath all of those is sort of various administrative data that helps us to monitor, and then evidence. And we're just at the place of thinking about how we follow up longitudinally to say, okay, once a child has finished a Shift programme, say 6 months, 12 months on, where are they now, and how can we think about the longer term impacts of Shift. So yeah, we're doing it, and please be in touch if you're interested in learning more.
Thank you so much, Amy. And then a question from Joe Tarbert. What advice would you give to a third sector organisation looking to work in the youth custody estate to produce the most meaningful outcomes for the young people they support?
Yeah, so my background before I came to Shift was in prisons. So I always start from a place of recognising that there are some really brilliant people who work in our prisons, as across all of our public services. But I would note that all aspects of prison life at the moment is really stretched. It's a really challenging context. It's challenging because of staff churn. It's challenging because there's been very fragmented leadership from a political perspective. There's massive overcrowding, particularly in the adult estate, and so I think that's really relevant for YCS youth custody because it is relatively small. So it sort of fights a bit for attention sometimes, I think a little bit. It's received quite significant criticism, so I think it's a bit of a bruised bit of the service at the moment, justifiably, you know, thinking about Cook and Wood, for example, but also, you know, there have been long-standing concerns across other YOIs, places like Felching, for example. And although the secure school, so Medway, that's now being run by Oasis as a secure school, provides a little bit of a you know, as a sort of a slight source of optimism. I think the reality around that doesn't really match the ambitions that we would have for how this sector should look. So I think all of that is really important context to be holding, and to note that now we have reduced the number of young people rightly going into custody. The YCS is really now working often with the children with really, really high levels of vulnerability. And I think there's a real question about how the training of those staff, their support, including clinical supervision, how adequate that is in the face of those challenges. And I think that particularly that's apparent around girls, and rightly the inspection report into Wetherby highlighted that girls are such a tiny, we're talking about a handful of girls in our YOIs, and they are some of the most profoundly least well served and least looked after. We should all be very worried about them. So I think for me, to do good work in the YCS requires a really careful understanding of culture and prison life, and it varies by place to place. Each institution has its own history, has its own norms. I often think that some of the great or some of the sort of skill set that's most helpful is that kind of ethnographic skill set, so that kind of deep hanging out in a place like a prison to really understand, you know, how it ticks, and then to find what its hooks are. So, you know, prisons don't want young people harming themselves or harming others. So like understanding how that is expressed operationally, and being humble in the face of the operational challenges of this environment, I think is a really good place to start. Governor support, so it's a bit like with SHiFT, we know that the support and buy-in of directors of children's services is absolutely critical, and we work really closely with them. Any work within the YCS, I would suggest needs to be, you need the governor absolutely bought in, and you probably need above that the sort of exec director and that kind of headquarters leadership to be really bought in as well. And you should go in expecting lots of resistance and lots of challenge, and have really good answers to those things. Using insiders can often be a really helpful approach there. So I think, you know, finding allies who are operational allies, because there's a real pecking order in prisons between operational and non-operational staff, a bit like in children's social care between qualified social workers and not. So you're working with it, you working within that paradigm in the custodial environment. And then I think the other thing for me would be about keeping your head. So I think prisons are total institutions, and it's really easy to level down in the face of level down in terms of your aspirations, level down in all sorts of ways that maybe aren't intentional, but it's about holding on to a real sense of purpose and kind of being normal in an environment that's profoundly abnormal. And I think that's sometimes in the secure estate where I've done my best work, is by bringing in that sort of outsider eyes with humility and care, and being alongside people to say, like, I know you want different, we all want different, and we can all do better if we can get alongside each other and find a common language. But yeah, never lose that sense of righteous anger in the face of things that are not right. Just find ways to channel that look after you and that look after the work. Prisons are deeply abnormal places.
Right, yeah, thank you, Amy. And I think we've got time for sort of maximum 1 or 2 more questions. But we have a question from Claire Paris. And Claire said, absolutely, it's an incredibly complex picture regarding complex needs across the broader young population / multi-agency context. But increasingly, we hear that it's white working class boys that are the biggest excluded group with lowest educational attainment too. Are you seeing this?
Yeah, so they're absolutely, and I think straight away of the Northeast in our work there, where we know that white working class boys are have poor outcomes. I mean, I think particularly educationally, there's some good evidence around that, and the group that we're working with in that area are predominantly white white boys in that particular area. So the question's absolutely right to point to geographical variation. The national picture remains one of disproportionality, black, brown, mixed heritage, but there's a proper focus on white working class boys. Within that, I would highlight young people from the Gypsy, Romany and Traveller community, the GRT community, and I think that's a community where because of various cultural norms, factors, professionals can find it hard to build relationships and be welcomed in, build that kind of trusting relationship, particularly where you're carrying enforcement responsibilities. So if you are a statutory social worker, but that can mean that sometimes we back off as professionals and aren't curious enough, aren't invested enough. So I think that as a group of a community is particularly of interest and concern to us, and of broader practice concern.
Great, thank you, Amy. And we do have a few more questions. I just wondered how many more you're sort of happy to run through.
I'll do them faster.
Brilliant. So we have a question. So hi, apologies if this is too specific a question. Do you think that the impending changes to out-of-court disposals, a two-tier system that requires specific conditions to be attached to cautions, will help reducing reoffending for 18 to 25-year-olds? And what's quite interesting about that is sort of the work that we do with our technology at Make Time Count, which is sort of like an end-to-end out-of-court resolution referral technology. So be interesting to hear your perspective here as well.
Yeah, I don't. So I feel like I'm not well equipped enough to answer specifically in relation to that, and so I don't. But what I could offer more broadly is that there are always risks of unintended consequences in changing approaches to sentencing, right? So one of the things that we know is that there can be a risk of up tariffing. If I give you examples where in some systems there is a position where if you get a sentence of less than a year, for example, you can't go into custody, right? That always has to, but there's always a risk at that edge of the 11 months versus 13 months of up tariffing. So while generally I think I'm in favour of more options at a sentencer's disposal, particularly more options that might keep someone in the community rather than custody, I think we have to be really alive to the risks of up tariffing, particularly where there is a dominant public narrative that community orders are a soft option. I think there's sometimes a risk that we're so rightly motivated by keeping someone out of custody, we then end up foisting conditions on them that are incredibly onerous, that sometimes set them up to fail, and then there's actually a risk of a failure and then the situation exacerbating. So I think it's always a kind of really careful juggle, holding all of those things in mind. And that's where I have to say I think it's so vital that we bring sentencers, but judges more broadly, judges and courts with us in conversation about what doing better looks like for these children and young people, and how do we invite judges to be using their discretion really thoughtfully, so that we're getting this right.
Thank you, Amy. That's great. And then we have two more questions, so that should hopefully bring us up to the hour. So Barnaby Norris has asked, I often find the balance of high support and high challenge can be difficult in relationship-based work. What advice would you give to ensure that relationships include both high support and appropriate challenge?
Yeah, it's really hard. We don't always get it right. I think in SHiFT, the child and family practice discussion is really critical. So this is a space where the practice as a whole hold the practitioner to account really of getting that balance right and getting it right consistently across all children, because I think that's the other kind of dynamic here. And I think it's something that is honed through experience, through really thoughtful supervision, and through really thoughtful collective supervision. And I don't think there's any shortcut to it. And we are always, all of us, struggling with that line. But I think it's it's the reflexivity around that that's actually the key to this. So recognising we're not always going to get it right, but we're committed to getting it as right as we can, and keeping both. It's that both and position: love, justice, boundaries, unconditional positive regard in the mix.
Cool. Thank you. That's really interesting. And just a final question from John Moore. Thinking about the future, do you have a sense to what extent Young Futures will work with violence reduction units? Are we seeing this as a complementary and building on the work of VRUs? And do you think one is going to replace the other?
I don't think one's going to replace the other, but as I sort of suggested earlier, I would really like this to be taken forward in a way that builds on the significant strengths and track record of particularly the more well-resourced VRUs. And in my version of the future, this would be a way of levelling up other VRUs in terms of resource and in terms of capability, so that we start having a more consistently equipped VRU community who can intelligently, thoughtfully commission services at that sort of regional level, to be thinking more systemically.
Perfect. And just one quick question from Angie. So if the programme is for 18 months, then what really happens after 18 months? Do their cases get referred further?
Yeah, so we have soft transitions. So with some children, they'll need longer than 18 months, and we continue to work with them. One of our 5 practice principles is step in to step back. So that what that means is that from the very get-go with this child and young person, our job is to make ourselves redundant. So it's about healthy, purposeful attachment, but all with the guide, but always with a view to making ourselves redundant. We want to strengthen those social networks, families, peers, other professional relationships, so that when we step back, they are stepping into a sustainable context. Now, we're not naive to the realities that some of these young people, they will further escalate, and our objective is to be within local authorities and have that continued practice, so that there is that flexibility for that young person to come back to us. But we're also hoping by modelling a different way of working, we start to infiltrate business as usual within the host organisation, within the organisation that's hosting the shift practice, so that the social worker that continues that work with the child, they've already been doing some of that journey with us anyway, co-working with the child, and their practice has already been shaped by the shift way of thinking. So that's it's not perfect. It requires flexibility and a real thoughtfulness about where do we place our efforts as shift in terms of resource, and opening up places for new young people who have high levels of needs to enter the programme, but also really honouring that commitment to relationships and sustained relationships with practitioners at the end of the programme and into the future. So we're working, and we'll get better at it. I think as we progress, we'll learn more about what works and learn more about what we need to do differently. And as part of that, we're thinking quite hard at Shift about our kind of alumni programme. So how do we meaningfully offer opportunities for participation for young people who want it, who've been through Shift, on an ongoing basis as part of the national team's remit.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Amy. That Q&A was also really insightful, and everyone was super engaged, and that sort of brings us up almost to the full hour. So I'd just like to say, Amy, thank you so much. It's been really insightful and just so interesting to hear about the work that Shift is doing. It's such important work, and to create like futures for young people that they can sort of break out of that cycle of crime. So I can't thank you enough on behalf of Make Time Count. And yes, thank you all for attending. We will make sure to send over sort of a wrap-up email with the webinar recording. Yeah, Amy, is there any sort of parting words that you'd like to say?
No, thank you all so much. Do be in touch if I can be useful.
Yeah, brilliant. I'll share your contact details around, Amy. So yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.